Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kathleen O'Curlick. I think I know all of you here actually. But it's my very great pleasure to introduce our annual Rotman lecturer for 2014-15, Helen Longino, who is the Clarence Irving Lewis Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University and of course immediate past president of the Philosophy of Science Association. She's also the author of 3 very well-received books. Science as Social Knowledge, Values and Objectivity in Scientific Inquiry was published by Princeton in 1990. The Fate of Knowledge, also Princeton, 2002, won the Robert K. Merton Professional Award for the Best Book of the Year. And most recently, Studying Human Behavior, How Scientists Investigate Aggression and Sexuality, came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2013. In addition, Professor Longino has co-edited several volumes and published an impressively large number of journal articles and book chapters. But these titles, numbers, and lists, however impressive they are, do not adequately reflect the role that she has played in our discipline. More than any other individual, Helen Longino has made feminist analyses of science count not only as respectable contributions to philosophy of science, but as something that is now pretty close to mainstream philosophy of science. She has done this by making good use of the style, the forms of discourse and argumentation that characterize traditional philosophy of science in order to create revolutionary change. Personally, I still remain very partial to some of the earlier articles, such as Body, Bias, and Behavior, co-authored and appearing in winter of '83, Can There Be a Feminist Science, from a 1987 issue of Hypatia. And as some of the grad students who are present today can attest, I assigned these articles, as well as Helen's more recent work, not only in the feminist epistemology courses, but also in the standard general philosophy of science courses. The important point is there's not a radical disconnect between Professor Longino's explicitly feminist publications and those that are seen as perhaps more mainstream. The emphasis on the social origins of knowledge and the social lives of scientific theories bind them together as a unified project. A project that has done much to change our discipline by making the social nature of science a central topic. Professor Longino's title this afternoon is Perspectives of Pluralities. Please join me in welcoming her to us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at Western. I've visited here before, and I've seen it in different seasons, and I'm given to believe that this is the incipient season of spring. It's also a great honor to have been invited to give this lecture this year, so I thank the Rotman Institute and all who are members of it for asking me to do so. I'm not going to give a lecture in art history, but I do want to begin today by talking a little bit about arenas in which perspective is a familiar topic of conversation. And that'll help make way, I think, for the points that I want to make in philosophy of science. The great invention in representational painting in the 15th and 16th century Europe is a way into some of the points that I want to make. First of all, as we all know, perspective in painting makes some aspects of a sensory field perspicuous and relegates others to the background or to negligibility. In representation, of course, we all know that some things get included and some things get excluded from representation. Of course, this is an imagined scene. This is a scene of a wedding. Who knows what else might have been going on. The painting highlights and just selects some aspects of it, but this painting is also used as a great example of the use of perspective in Renaissance painting, where it was discovered, in a way attributable to Brunelleschi that it was possible to construct visual representations that gave the illusion of depth, that in fact represented depth, that presented depth in a two-dimensional, presented 3 dimensions in a two-dimensional field. One of my points is that perspective is achieved and was achieved by the Renaissance painters by inventing and then employing specific instruments and strategies for constructing the representations that they constructed. And now, of course, you can learn how to do this online, but so it's become rather quotidian. But nevertheless, it took invention, and it takes specific strategies to be able to construct these representations. What perspective also does is to direct our attention to some aspects of a visual field as opposed to others. It does that by foregrounding these aspects. So the wedding, we could be seeing the wedding from a distance. If we were there, we could be seeing lots of other events going on around the wedding, but this representation puts us right in front of this group. It makes by centering the officiator and the 2 partners in the wedding, it draws our attention to that particular event, and everything else is there, but is part of the background. So this great invention in painting is one of the things we think of when we think about perspective and what perspective can do. And as representational art developed, there are many other ways in which to make salient certain aspects of a scene and diminish our attention to others. We can do it through the relative size of figures in the two-dimensional space, by foregrounding, as these are foregrounded. We can use vividness of color, and the colors of the foreground figures are more vivid than the colors in the background by the inclusion or omission of elements that are in the scene that's being represented, by the choice of point of view from which the scene is depicted, all of which this image of the wedding illustrates. And that choice of point of view also positions the viewer, it positions us with respect to the event. So actually the poster for this lecture made the point also very vividly, because the poster, which if you recall is this kind of wonderful view of a sky, which puts us, the viewers of the poster, at the bottom, the base of a building, an enclosed courtyard, and we are looking up. Right? That's what that representation does. So it puts us in a certain position vis-a-vis the object being represented. Now, representation is not the only situation in which we as visual perceivers experience perspective. There's a quite different kind of perspective that's involved in just our experiences of vision. And here I'm borrowing from my former colleague Ron Geary in introducing perspective through thinking about features of color vision. Right? We all learn at some point that our visual system is composed of rods and cones, and rods are receptors that are sensitive to different intensities, while cones have chromatic receptivity. Humans have 3, most humans, as the Color Blindness Institute will remind us, most humans have what's called trichromatic, have 3 cones, and have what's called trichromatic color vision. And our color vision is a function not of the direct perception of colors, but it's a matter of the cones are differentially sensitive to variation in color. So what the cones are really sensitive to are variations in wavelength rather than kind of direct representers of color. So someone who doesn't have all 3 cones operating in the way most humans do just won't see what trichromats will see. This is a representation of what's generally called color blindness. Color blindness can either be insensitivity to red or to green, and you see those have been washed out from that earlier. Whoops, I didn't mean to go there. Anyway, well, here I am. That earlier image. It's also possible that no cones function, which gives us achromatic color vision, as on the right. So a scene seemingly filled with color on the left by an achromat will be perceived as the image on your right. Our very visual experience now, this is not a representation, this is a representation of what we see, obviously, but our own experience is a function of the structures of our visual system, right? And depending on what those structures are like, our visual experience will, of the same phenomenon is going to vary. So that our structures of vision provide a kind of perspective. They're a kind of perspective, and one reason to think of them as perspective, Geary says, of course, is that it's not that one is better than another. The achromats, and there are species with achromatic vision, are able to detect certain things in their environments that chromatic vision would make much more difficult to detect. So there are different contexts in which these different visual systems are differentially advantageous. A third kind of example of perspective is given by maps. And there are all kinds of different maps that one could use to make this point. You know, we make maps that emphasize geophysical features of a terrain. We make maps that feature the human uses of a terrain. We make maps that show political boundaries in a terrain. All these can be different ways of representing the same phenomenon. The Mercator projection was designed for navigational purposes, right, to enable ships, especially to navigate across the seas where they didn't have many landmarks, and it enabled the drawing of course lines across the oceans so that one could so the navigator on the ship could keep a ship on course so they could get from point A to point B. There's another kind of map of the same phenomenon. The Peter projection, the point of the Peter projection, or the Gall-Peter projection, is not to enable navigation. The point of the Gall-Peter projection is to enable comparison of actual areas, right? So there's neither of these maps is a better map than the other. Neither is a better representation than the other. They do different kinds of things. So, all right. So, in Renaissance painting and contemporary map making, the makers of the artifacts have to select particular techniques for producing an image of a three-dimensional space in 2 dimensions. The map makers have to take a curved or a 3-dimensional sphere and try to transform it into 2 dimensions. The Renaissance painters just took a scene unfolding, imagined to unfold in front of a viewer and tried to represent it in 2 dimensions. In vision, the anatomy and physiology of the brain's visual system determines our color experience. So from both of those, I think we can draw the lesson that perspective is a function of the position, access, and organic structure of the perceiving organism, and that different position, different access, or structure are going to constitute different perspectives and yield different content. Okay, so I want to talk about perspective in philosophy, in science, and I want to talk about it in 2 ways. First, I want to talk about the perspectives that we take on science, and then I want to talk about perspective in science. As far as perspectives on science, and the we here is philosophers, mostly philosophers of science, what I mean here is the philosophical approaches that we take to the analysis of the sciences. And when I speak of perspectives in science, I'm thinking of what I elsewhere call investigative approaches. So, as far as thinking about perspectives that we take on science, there are, I think, 2 contrasts that are of interest to me. There are others, of course, but these are 2 very related contrasts. One is the contrast between focusing on scientific theories and focusing on scientific practices. When we're focusing on the content, the deliverances of scientific research, we're taking what we might call a theory-centric, and of course, if we think there aren't really theories, there are models, we could take a model-centric perspective. But it's a perspective that focuses on the results, on the outcomes of research. Call it theory-centric. And that's contrasted with a focus on the practices of the sciences, which is an interest in how those results, those outcomes, theories, models, are actually produced. So that's a practice-centric perspective. And the issues, especially the philosophical issues of content, theory, and practice, content and method, they're different, but they're also very entangled with each other, which is why one might want to use the word centric, because you can have polycentric. So you think of philosophy as a polycentric investigation, right? The other perspective is the foreground-background, which is very closely connected to the theory-practice distinction in perspective, because we can focus on sort of what is immediately available to us in scientific work, and here we can go beyond the theories themselves to thinking about what's presented as evidence, what's presented as data, but that's all sort of the foreground, we might say, is what gets presented to us, say, in journal articles. And the background is how the material that's in the journal articles gets generated in the first place. What's going on in the laboratory? What kinds of decisions are being made in the selection of data? What kinds of assumptions are being brought to bear in the interpretation of data? So if we're taking a theory-centric or content perspective, there are all kinds of philosophical questions that we may be interested in. We're interested in what kinds of claims a theory or hypothesis might be making about the natural or social worlds. We might be asking how those claims relate to claims that are made or supported in other theories, how they relate to broader metaphysical questions like what is there really? Is there really just particles in motion or just energy fields, mid-size objects? Is what there is really just the observable world, the directly measurable world, or the entities and processes postulated in successful scientific theories? Is it better to speak in terms of entities or processes? So these are all kinds of questions that we can ask about the foregrounded material that we get from just looking at what the sciences tell us. Taking a practice-centered perspective, though, we might ask different questions. We might ask, well, just what are the questions that are being asked in a specific scientific subdiscipline or approach within a subdiscipline? What are the methods and strategies that are employed to answer those questions? What do these methods enable us to conclude about a given subject matter? And why do researchers select particular methods from those available? Now, this last question might lead you to think, well, isn't that just sociology? I think that there's a close relationship between some forms of sociological investigation and a practice-centered approach to philosophy of science. But as I'll emphasize again at the end, the questions we ask are different. And as philosophers, the questions that we ask are related to the supposition that the sciences do somehow create knowledge. Right? So our questions are, what kind of knowledge is it that the sciences create? So in the practice-centered approach, we'll start, or that's not even necessarily in the practice-centered approach, but as philosophers, we start our investigations into science with some more or less elaborate sense of what counts as a cognitive practice. That is, we go in there with not totally naive. Some of you may remember reading Bruno Latour's Laboratory Life, where he takes the stranger perspective, or he and Woolgar take the stranger perspective and go into the lab at the Salk Institute as though they know nothing, and they have no preconceptions about what's going on, no preconceptions about knowledge, evidence, or anything, and they give us this really interesting description of what's going on that has really nothing to do, and that's what they want to emphasize. It seems to have nothing to do with cognitive processes at all. It's all about exchanging things, gaining credit, giving credit, all that kind of stuff. It's lovely, but philosophers rightly think, well, there's got to be something else going on. In any case, we don't go in with that totally naive approach. We go in with some sense of what's going to count as a cognitive practice, what counts as a good reason. We expect to find something that's treated as evidence. And then we use what we discover in the bit of science that we're looking at to interpret what's going on and make it available for criticism, and possibly even refine or challenge the philosophical notions that we came into the investigation with. So philosophers do have work to do here, but we can't do all of it. And what we start investigating when we investigate these questions is very much entangled with the particular social structures, and that's certainly the kind of thing that Latour and Woolgar pointed to in Laboratory Life, and that sociologists of science have been making clear in many ways. These kind of decisions about investigation take place in a social context, and that social context, the social structure, the social interactions, are really a scaffolding for the cognitive activities that philosophers are interested in. And I think we can't fully understand the cognitive activities unless we also understand something about the social structures. Taking that point of view, the social scaffolding and interaction constitutes support for and resources for the cognitive and not deviations from it. And as such, I think that social structure and social interactions are not just epistemologically relevant, but arguably at least partially constitutive of the cognitive. But I've made that argument elsewhere, and I'm not going to repeat it today. So coming back to practice-centered philosophical questions, I've already mentioned some of them. What are the questions of a specific scientific subdiscipline? What methods and strategies are employed to answer those questions? What do those methods and strategies count as evidence? How is what counts as evidence brought to bear on the substantive claims being made, or as one says, suggested? What are the standards of acceptability or acceptance that are operative in a particular context? And how do these practices relate to the epistemological concepts that we come in there with, concepts like rationality, objectivity, and evidence? So if we start not from questions about theories and general theses about theories, that is, about the representations, or concerns about holism, or questions about scientific realism versus scientific anti-realism, or questions about how to establish or argue for the cognitive authority of science, but rather from questions arising from the examination of particular episodes of scientific investigation, episodes that occur now. If we start from the investigation of practice, we are frequently confronted with specific instances of underdetermination. That is, in looking at a particular area of research, it often becomes evident to us that the data that are available to a given body of researchers are not sufficient to rule out all but one of a set of alternative hypotheses, requiring auxiliary assumptions to bridge the gap, even to show how a set of data are relevant to a given kind of hypothesis. So what practice researchers have to ask is, are auxiliary assumptions at work in this context? What are they? And that question is a question that foregrounds not so much the social background, but the intellectual background of the investigation. So we'll want to know, what are the background assumptions, auxiliary assumptions at work? What are the grounds that support them? Are there alternatives in active or at least available for active play? And how are the alternatives attended to? The auxiliaries or background assumptions provide intellectual scaffolding, and questions about their status prompts questions about the social scaffolding. So to get a kind of full picture of what's going on, I think you need both the investigation of the cognitive dimension that the philosopher engages in to kind of get the intellectual picture, and also the kinds of questions that the sociologist engages in. And when we kind of start probing the auxiliaries, we start asking questions about that social scaffolding. What are the social practices that are playing a role in sustaining a given set of auxiliaries? We have questions about intellectual social relations or other approaches or research projects that bear on the phenomena under investigation. We have questions about the social relations among the scientists and about the institutions that make certain scientific questions salient at a particular time and others not. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to just talk from some of the things I was doing in my most recent book, Studying Human Behavior. And I'll just say a little bit something in general about it, and then talk about a way in which the mechanisms of perspective are at work in this body of research. So the project was looked at a variety of different empirical research, right? Empirical research in a variety of different sciences, approaches to behavior that draw on different bodies of scientific investigation. So we have quantitative behavior genetics that draws primarily on classical genetics, molecular behavior genetics that draws on contemporary molecular biology, work in the neurophysiology of behavior that of course draws on work in neuroscience. Social environment-oriented psychology I included because in many instances it is set up as the alternative to biological approaches, so it's related to biology in that way. And then I also looked at a variety of approaches that attempt to integrate some of these approaches that are focusing on single factors. And you can see in gray there an approach that I came to late in the project, which I'm going to be talking about more tomorrow. It's in gray because it's interestingly different from those other approaches. Okay, and so the project was so many of our colleagues in philosophy of science have looked at some of this material and taken a side. That's one of the standard kinds of attitudes towards research on behavior. Behavior genetics can't show us anything, or behavior genetics can show us everything. Neurophysiology can't tell us anything. Neurophysiology can tell us everything. And I didn't want to go that route. I was interested in doing a different kind of project, which is looking at all of these and trying to come to some understanding of what it is they can each accomplish and what it is that they can't accomplish. And does it even make sense to think of them as empirical competitors in such a way that one could say, yes, behavior genetics is the way to go if we're studying behavior, or neurophysiology is the way to go if we're studying behavior? Does that even make sense? Okay, so those were the questions I had, and I persisted with the project because I thought there were some interesting social implications. Again, that's something for tomorrow. I'm not advertising the talk, but as it turns out, I am going to be advertising the talk for tomorrow a little bit. So there were some interesting and I think important social implications of paying attention to this work. This comparative study that I undertook, I think, kind of illustrates the way perspectives in science can operate. And by perspectives here, I mean something that I've also called approach. And it's kind of like the cones in our visual system, although operate very differently. It's kind of like the instruments that were developed to be able to represent depth of field in visual representation, but it's different. So an approach is a set of questions, a set of experimental and observational strategies for answering those questions, patterns of argument, and a range of alternative hypotheses. And in the work that I looked at, these tend to carry an implicit model of the processes that are being investigated, an implicit theory, implicit model, but really articulation of the model or development of a theory isn't the main concern. Rather, it's the pursuit of kind of particular questions in particular experimental or in some cases clinical contexts, which doesn't mean that researchers aren't committed to a big picture. And when you look at some of the debates that occur across approaches, it becomes clear that there is at least an implicit theory that's informing the approach, but proving the theory, confirming the theory, that is not the main concern. The main concern is to build a body of results that seem to be consistent with or consequences of the theory when applied to particular situations. Okay, so what might be being investigated? Well, one thing that's commonly investigated in thinking about behavior is, what makes for differences in behavior among human beings. What accounts for the variation of some trait T in some population P? Now, as it turns out, I investigated two families of, or I investigated research on two families of behavior, aggression and sexual orientation, but T can be anything. So researchers ask about all kinds of things, like divorce, for example. What accounts for variation in divorce, in the expression in divorce in a given population? So using the comparative methodology, that is trying to think about, for each of these approaches that I looked at, what are the questions, what's counting as evidence, what are the hypotheses, and so forth, I came up with a horizontal table that I call the potential causal field. And this array is just the array of causal, or if you don't like causal language, independent factors that are going to be investigated, for which variation in behavior or some behavior is going to be a dependent, treated as a dependent variable. So different approaches are going to investigate different areas of this potential causal space. Well, behavior genetics is not going to investigate physiology. Sociological researchers looking at either shared or non-shared environment are probably not going to be looking at hormone secretory patterns. They don't, as I'll say later, they don't have the equipment to do that, right? They have equipment, they have instruments, each of these approaches, for measuring certain kinds of thing. And the task of the researchers is to associate, let's go back, measured variation in any one, or possibly a subset in some cases, one, measure variation in one of those areas of the potential causal space with the behavioral variation that they are interested in. And of course, that requires methodologies for conducting measurement. Right? You have to have ways of ascertaining genetic similarity, for example. You have to have ways of ascertaining similarity in neurophysiological process and difference in these processes to associate with the variation that you're actually interested in. And application of whatever these methodologies are de facto parses the potential causal field into different fields, so that what researchers are investigating is not that whole array, but a subset of the array. So a molecular geneticist has a couple of different methodologies to use. Linkage analysis, which is intended to associate specific regions of the genome with a trait, or genome-wide association studies, which associate genome-wide variation with a trait. So that's the causal space that they investigate, and when correlations between the variations in the causal space and variations in the trait fail to be complete, we recognize that there's a category other, sometimes called noise, but a category other, which is going to account for that part of the variation in the area investigated that is not accounted for by the variation in the causal space. All right, so you can see the same thing happening in these other areas. The quantitative behavior genetics is going to use inferred degrees of biological relatedness through twin and adoption studies to make support conclusions about relation between genomic variation and behavioral variation. Quantitative behavior genetics uses the measurement of degrees of biological relation to try to attribute some of the variation in the expression of the trait to genetic variation and other of the variation in the trait to environmental variation, but there's still stuff left over from that, and we still have the category other. Now, of course, all right, social environmental approaches, we can say the same thing, that there's direct observation and measurement of environmental variables. So I'm not going to go through that. That correlates exposure to environmental variables with the expression of T in the population. And again, we've got a specification of the particular areas that we're investigating, and then whatever is not correlatable with the variation in the investigated causal space. Is it attributed to other or to noise, or as Paul Teller says, they just pencil it in and wait for more information. Neurobiological approaches, so signatures of physiological processes. So, for example, the metabolites of peptides with expression of a trait, or structural variation as determined by PET scans, fMRI, EEG with variation in the trait. So the point is that the methods for measuring variation in a given causal space, and hence for measuring the strength of association of variation in that space and variation in the trait, they vary, and they shape the field of investigation and the association measures that are possible in that field. It turns out that classification methods of the different approaches are going to place the same factor in different categories. I wrote about in the book, and I won't go into this because my time is really running short here, but some factors that are treated as environmental factors by social environmental approaches, who are looking at things that they can actually measure in the environment, disappear from the causal space of the behavior geneticist, because they are not because the behavior geneticist just has a kind of catch-all category of environment, which is simply what is not accounted for by biological relatedness. Right, so if that was too fast, I'd be happy to talk more about it later. But the idea here is that values that are assigned to the set of purported causal factors within an approach ultimately have to sum to 100%, because, and that's why you have the category other, right? Because you've got to account for 100% of the variation that you're looking at. But when the values have to sum to 100, then different parsings of the causal space, that is where you have different kinds of thing placed differently in the causal space, that's going to yield different values for the same factor. So molecular genetic investigation, for example, can produce data that's sufficient in terms of what can be done here, even if you can't make comparisons, what can be done. Molecular genetic investigation can certainly provide data that's sufficient to distinguish between alternative molecular genetic hypotheses. So mutation mu versus mutation mu2 is more highly associable with some trait T, or a particular genetic mutation is associable with some trait T. The point is that the methods for determining the degree of association of one or several genetic mutations with some trait of interest can't determine the degree of association of variation in a neurophysiological factor with a trait of interest, nor of association of a social environmental factor with that trait. So each approach has a distinctive set of methods that require it to parse the potential causal space in a particular way. And that gives us different and incommensurable measurements of the phenomena. And in addition, investigation within an approach can't produce data that are sufficient to establish the empirical superiority of hypotheses that are articulable within one approach to hypotheses that are articulable within another approach. And the same is true for the other approaches. Each requires, as a background or auxiliary assumption, a particular parsing of the causal space. So the data function as evidence for hypotheses within an approach on the assumption that the parsing is correct. So each approach measures variation in a differently construed causal space. There is no common measurement of potential causal factors. They're investigated independently in the different approaches. And so the approaches are evidentially incommensurable. They're not, because the measurements are different, and so they can't be taken to be empirical competitors in any significant way. So we have incommensurability, and this is, I would note, not Kuhnian incommensurability, but it's because the language, the language is shared, right? But it is incommensurability of measurement. And we have incompatibility at the level of theoretical pronouncement. That is, when researchers come out of their laboratory and affirm the kind of generalization from their study, namely that behavior is dependent on genetic factors, or behavior is dependent on, shaped by social factors. Those are incompatible claims, right? So okay. Nevertheless, all the approaches, this is the point, they are productive. They're incommensurable, incompatible, but they're productive in the sense that they are able to produce results that are replicable and that can be put to use in either cognitive or practical projects. Each of them reveals relationships that can't be revealed by another approach. So I want to suggest that this plurality that we can see unfolding in front of us supports a philosophical pluralism, that is an attitude or stance of pluralism to take towards those factors. That is, not to suppose that one of them has to be right or that they have to be integrated in a particular way that gives us a single comprehensive approach, because doing that will lead us to lose information that the particular approaches can provide. So I think I'll skip that argument, which is to the conclusion that plurality is a permanent possibility. If you've swallowed the Kool-Aid I just gave you, you should see why I think that in any case. Okay. So let me come back then to the the background. The parsing of causal space that I've described is an assumption that shapes evidential relevance. But you might ask, what about the construction of the data in the first place? Exploration of the background isn't limited to identifying the assumptions that are involved in establishing evidential relevance, but also extends to the assumptions involved in the construction of the data that are going to serve as evidence. So in thinking about behavior, how are the behavioral categories that are the subject of the research operationalized for purposes of measurement? How is it that they get operationalized so that they can be incorporated into any one of these approaches? The research on violence is also conducted as research on aggression, as I discovered when I started working on this body of research. And so it's taken to be relevant to research on aggression is taken to be relevant to understanding violence, it's taken to be relevant to understanding crime. So one might want to know, how are aggression or violence measured? Okay, this is another ad for tomorrow's talk, because I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow afternoon. But it's to draw attention to this set of issues, which are, again, a part of the background and what we're looking at when we're looking at practices. How are, in this case, the behavioral categories that are the subject of research operationalized for purposes of measurement? But we might ask that about anything that we're trying to study. How are these objects that we're trying to study, these measured? How do we measure the constructs that we think we're studying? Well, we have to do that through some kind of operationalization. And this turns out to be actually quite challenging, as I'm sure any of you who are looking at scientific research have found, that data doesn't present itself as data. Data doesn't present itself, and definitely doesn't present itself as evidence. It has to be made into evidence, which is not to say that it's totally constructed out of thin air, right? There's definitely something that is being measured, but to make those measurements useful, more work is required. So these are all questions that we want to think about, and additional questions. How does what it is that can be measured influence what it is that can be known? Then there are these other questions in what approaches do given conceptualizations feature? How does the use of a given conceptualization of the phenomenon constrain the actual scope of the investigation as opposed to the intended scope, right? How are these conceptualizations preserved or modified as they travel from the laboratory out to the broader research world and then to policy and general knowledge? What kinds of transformations do the research reports undergo in this travel? And how do they reflect and, as they travel, reinforce social preconceptions? So these are all questions that I think we need to be asking. Foregrounding the background in this way displays evidential structure in a way that opens the structure to critical or normative engagement. It doesn't necessarily make perspicuous the particular values that are operative, but it can make perspicuous the fact that values are very likely operative, that are informing the constitution of data in a particular way. And again, this is not to dismiss forms of genetic investigation or neurobiological investigation, but it's really to ask what questions a given approach can answer, as well as be clearer about what questions a given approach cannot answer, and then also to think about to what broader concerns these questions or their answers might or might not be relevant. And so I've talked about a particularly topical area in behavioral science, but I think that there are lots of other areas of scientific investigation where taking this kind of comparative approach might be helpful. That areas that are going to show similar kinds of complexities in the construction and organization and interpretation of data. So one task for practice-oriented philosophers is really to dig into the evidential structure of the sciences in which they're interested. There's already, I think, some interesting work going on in climate research and biomedical research, but I think one can take a comparative approach to debates in educational research. There's a question in education. Should we measure the effectiveness of educational interventions by looking at average scores across an entire school population or across an entire school district? Or should we use the mean scores of different demographic groups in the district? In economic research, big question, what caused the maybe this didn't matter so much. I know Canadians weren't as affected as folks in the United States were by the economic collapse in 2008, but but it's a big question. You know, what caused it? Was it an out of control financial system, or was it the government, the mortgage lending practices of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which encouraged irresponsible lending and borrowing practices? Okay. There's arguments on both sides, although I did introduce one with some value-laden terminology. There are arguments for that view. You know, in some cases in this work, especially on socially relevant matters, positions are going to be reflected in or disproportionately supported by some aspect of or approach in the research. And to understand the possible role of social values, I think we have to look not just to the external agent. So this is, in a way, what many sociologists do, is to look at the external factors, look at the way in which the researchers are embedded in other social organizations to kind of think about what values might be informing. But I think, you know, we also want to look at the structure of proposed evidential relations to see what data are taken as relevant, and in light of what considerations they're taken as relevant. So, and that question is going to sort of show us where we want to ask about potential inroads or potential influence of social values. So we need to foreground the background. Now, there are also, you know, as I said earlier, the philosophical and the sociological investigation of the background are entangled with each other. I just indicated why taking a purely sociological approach, just looking at the social context in which the researchers are embedded, isn't enough, because you really need to know something about the structure of the research. But, you know, then we have a question. Well, some approaches are more visible than others. Why would that be the case? Why is it that we learn so much more about what's going on in the genetics of behavior than we, and to some extent even the neurophysiology of behavior, than we learn about what might be going on in other approaches? Some assumptions seem more available or more acceptable than others. What are the factors that play a role in the availability and acceptability of those assumptions? Some conceptualizations of the phenomena are entrenched, that is, they barely change. How do they become entrenched in those ways? I think, as I said, philosophical analysis can make some headway here, because we can kind of show where these questions are important, but these are also questions about the social scaffolding of the research that sociological investigation might be able to answer. The sociological investigation, though, I think needs the interpretive and cognitive investigation of the philosopher, which can actually generate the questions in a form that makes them relevant to answering our questions about evidence, relative credibility, and so forth. So more collaboration across that boundary would be really useful. And I just want to close with some remarks about a more general task for philosophers. I think that overestimations of the degree of certainty that we can expect from scientific research supports a general skepticism about the sciences, kind of paradoxically. Partly it has to do with an everyday common sense concept of evidence that draws from the legal context, that beyond reasonable doubt context, which of course contrasts very sharply with the scientific context, in which reasonable doubt is a slogan, right? I mean, scientists are doubters and scientists are skeptics. Right? Scientists don't take for granted what is in front of them. They look more deeply. So I think a more modest understanding of evidential relations, such as the kinds I've sketched out, so we're not looking for evidence that supports one approach over others as the approach that's going to generate all the correct answers. A more modest understanding supports not skepticism, but rather closer scrutiny of the arguments that are being offered, including statements about purported evidence and of the assumptions in light of which purported evidence actually functions as evidence. So I think our work as philosophers ought to include promulgating non-inflationary concepts of scientific acceptability. So we should become ourselves adept at identifying perspectives, varying perspectives in a field of research that give rise to plurality, and learn how to communicate this to a public whose reliance on science we are seeking to encourage and support. I think that non-inflationary concepts are going to be more likely to facilitate appreciation of the complexity of factors that go into scientific assessment and interpretation of data than rejection of a hypothesis simply because there are also data that serve as evidence for an alternative to think about one particular kind of debate that is socially salient right now. So I think that philosophy of science has a really important role to play in our complex techno-scientific culture. It plays that role effectively when it attends not just to the cognitive outcomes of scientific inquiry, that is to theory, to what we have in the foreground, but when it also attends to the practices and social conditions that generate those outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and the floor is open now for questions. Yes?
I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about the incommensurability of the measurements. I'm not sure if I understand why they're incommensurable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see if I can remember.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, yes. Good point. Yes, the question was, could I go over in a little bit more detail the point about the incommensurability of measurement? Yes. So, okay. Can I stop this? I want to go back. Or, yeah. That's legible enough. So, when the causal space, the potential causal space, is parsed into a subarea of that that space, researchers are going to take different kinds of thing will go in different ways. So features of the intrauterine environment will be treated as part of the non-genetic and hence environmental factors by one approach, and will be treated as non-environmental but biological by another approach. So that what the measurement of the correlation between environmental and non-environmental is going to be different than the kind of correlation one gets when uterine factors are in a different part of the space. So so part of it is that different factors that this kind of array makes visible get included in different portions of the space depending on the methodologies that are being brought to bear for measurement. And that's why they're incommensurable. It's not as though we've got the same measurement strategies that place the same phenomenon in the same box, if you will, that enables us to then compare the social environmental approach with the genetic approach. So that's one way in which they're incommensurable.
Do I get to follow up?
Follow up, sure.
So the reason that I'm asking is because at some point you mentioned integration of approaches, and it seems like that there's some tension there between if these variables or these causal factors are actually truly incommensurable, then how can you get truly integrative approaches?
Well, that's an excellent question.
Maybe
That's. I mean, there are definitely efforts at integrative approaches, and some are more plausible than others. They're actually the one that's most plausible is the one that's been developed by, although there are lots of criticism of it, but these guys are a couple, Terry Moffat and Avshalom Caspi, which is their gene by environment model, and they've done. They've got a population of 1,000 individuals who were born in a city in New Zealand in 1970, something. So anyway, all born in the same year, and they've been collecting data on this group of people in a longitudinal study since they were born, and they collect kind of genetic data. They collect experiential data, and then they collect data about various kinds of adult outcomes, including behavioral outcomes. What they found with respect to some behavioral phenomena is that while genetic variation considered alone couldn't account for variation in various measures of antisocial behavior, including aggression and criminality and so forth, and childhood trauma, usually abuse, could account for some. They found a much higher correlation in those members of that population who both had a particular genetic configuration, that is the gene for higher production of monoamine acid, which is involved in the metabolism of serotonin. So they found a better correlation among people who had both that monoamine gene and had experienced abuse as children. So that's an effort at integration. So they claim, they've looked at both. What they're claiming is that gene and it's genes and environment. And of course, everybody knows that it's genes and environment. The question is how you actually get at that. What they're claiming is that this way of investigating shows the interaction of genes and environment is playing a major causal role in these behavioral outcomes. Of course, they're not explaining all of the expressions of antisocial behavior that they've actually determined with this. There you have an effort to bring research approaches together. That is, to integrate information from genetic research and to integrate information from social environmental research. The measurements are not commensurable in the sense that would be required for determining that one approach is better than another. They're not competitive. I mean, they don't support competition in that way. And so I see this as just yet another in the array of different approaches. Because again, there are expressions of the traits that they're looking at that are not accounted for by the coincidence of a genetic configuration and a childhood experience. And all of that remains in the other category. So one way of thinking about it is that the category of other kind of changes from approach to approach, so that they're just, it's not so much that they're not measuring the same thing, it's that the methods of measurement provide different measurements leading to different judgments about the influence of one factor as opposed to another, the relative influence of one factor as opposed to another.
I think Jackie was next.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that a lot. I was wondering if perspectives are specific to specific areas of science, or if in a given area of science, you could have multiple different perspectives, and then even in given individual labs, you might have different perspectives across labs. And how do we want to construe these?
How do we individuate?
Yeah, how do we individuate perspectives?
Yeah. Big metaphysical question.
Sorry.
No, but the answer is yes to all of those. That is, I'm sure you can have different perspectives. It's harder actually to have different perspectives within a lab, but certainly across labs, there are definitely different perspectives. And what I was thinking actually when you first started your question is, well, how do we delimit a science or a subfield of science, right? So we can delimit a subfield by the approaches it shares, or we can delimit a subfield by the phenomenon or the set of phenomena that it's trying to account for or explain. And I think that's going to give different we're going to get different principles of individuation depending on which of those we take. So
then the story may be quite a bit more.
it could be much more complicated. Yeah.
Yes.
So I have a clarification question and then a follow-up question. So when we look at these different categories in the causal field, are they supposed to be mutually exclusive?
Well, the genotype 1 and 2 are not mutually exclusive. They're accessed by different methods of investigation, but of course they're not mutually exclusive. And I'm not sure what you mean by mutually exclusive. They do represent different biological phenomena, and in some cases social phenomena.
So maybe just to clarify, so what I mean by mutually exclusive is Because if one of these is considered a source of variance, that can explain the variance in a trait. Can it not be absorbed by any of those other sources of variance?
Oh, no, I don't think that that's no, it's not the case that it can't be absorbed by other sources of variance. In fact, there's work that tries to show that variation in physiology is correlated with genetic variation. So there's lots of work like that. So yeah, they're not exclusive in that sense.
Okay, so we could potentially imagine another approach where the set of categories is actually the entire causal field, and what you're saying is that if one did that, these would not add up to 100%, explaining the sources of variance.
Well, what I'm saying is that, one thing I'm saying, going back to the previous question, is that it's not clear what it would, actually, if you add up the results in all of these, you probably get more than 100%.
Yeah.
Is what you would get.
Okay, so if that's the case, then it seems to me that this incommensurability issue and sort of the mismatching of a factor depending on which approach you take and what bin it falls into in this causal field really comes down to the fact that these are not explaining uniquely sources of variance, that there's overlap between these various bins. And so you're going to get sometimes an item falling into one bin under one approach and a different bin under another approach. And what we really want maybe is a causal field where when you cut it up, each of those elements combine to a 100% accounting of the variance of the tree. And that way we would have a systematic approach when we look at these different sub-approaches. Anything that doesn't fall, so for example on the behavioral, the quantitative genetics approach, anything that doesn't fall under genotype, shared or non-shared environment has to go into other. And then when we look at another approach, like the neurobiological approach, all of those things that are not genotype, shared, non-shared environment, they have to go into other. They can't fall into physiology, for example. And that way, it seems to me, if we had a causal field cut up that way, we could actually look across levels and kind of make sense of, well, this factor, if that makes sense.
Well, that would be a project for someone. There is an effort at a total integrative approach, but it's doing something very different from what you're suggesting. The developmental systems approach, which argues that all of these factors are causally on a par one with another, and that to investigate any kind of phenotypic trait, you have to look at the ways in which all of the factors are interacting with each other. But that's a very different picture from yours, which is supposing that we could actually parse the world into such a way that we could create these non-overlapping bins. And I'm just not sure that that's really possible. But
yeah, well, to that point, I think so for dynamic systems theory, one thing they have right is that it's a bit more hierarchical. And so we would think that some of these gene environment interactions are producing some of the neurobiology structures that we see at the neurobiological level. And, that seems to me to be the right way to do it. But even if we do it that way, we should still be able to parse things up in the relevant ways that we can explain things uniquely at the behavioral level, for example.
well, for some people, that's a hope. I'd like to see it done. And then I think this kind of investigation would ask the same kinds of questions of that approach as I'm asking here. And one of the things you would look at is, well, how distinct really are the bins? How is it that one item gets incorporated into one rather than another, and what kind of causal independence of one from another is being assumed in the construction of this comprehensive causal space?
I think Amy was next.
So I was wondering, how do you conceive of the epistemic status of the choice between approaches? So we have a set of, as scientists, we might have these sets of approaches available to us. And maybe your social condition or the values you happen to hold or who you were trained with will help condition which approach you choose, or the associated values that you might prefer. But I wonder if we cast it in a totally pragmatic language, if we do that, then we might also undermine the epistemic status of the values that are associated with that choice, and thus the role that the values might play in that system when we're doing things like interpreting data.
Okay, so what is it that undermines? Where's the undermining taking place? What is it that's undermined, and what is
So if it's purely a pragmatic choice, or if it's something that can be arbitrary, or just a kind of feature of, say, my narrative descriptively, then because I happen to be a certain way, that I would choose a certain approach, then it's not clear that the choice is epistemically grounded in anything. It's just a feature of who I am, but that seems really unsatisfactory.
Well, I think actually for many individuals it is pretty arbitrary and contingent. You know, it's who your teachers were, what courses really turned you on. So, you know, I think what we end up doing is very much a matter of these really contingent features of our experience. But for a community engaged in research, there is, I think, a question to be asked, where it's not about the individuals who make up the community, but the community that takes there to be value in pursuing a line of research. And there, I think, the answer is got to be of a pragmatic sort, namely, it's what kind of information is generable from this approach, and for what human projects, whether these are cognitive projects or social or practical projects, for what kinds of projects is this information going to be valuable? So the choice of approach itself I don't see it as needing to be epistemologically grounded or epistemically grounded. It is grounded in, but I do see it grounded in what we might call cognitive or practical goals of getting some kinds of information as opposed to other kinds of information.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could advance the slide a couple. There's one thing that I want to look at. Maybe about
Going forward or backwards?
forward, I think about 5 slides. Sorry, keep going.
Well, I don't think, is it a text slide or one of the?
It's a text slide. It has to do with assuming that the parsing is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, there
This
we
one?
go.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what sort of evidence can be given for the assumption that the parsing is correct? Because it seems like if some things are going to fade if some things are going to fade into the background, if your approach is different, then how can we, what sort of evidence can we have that the parsing we've done in the first place is correct?
Well, that was what my talk about perspectives at the beginning was intended to forestall. It's not clear that any particular parsing is the correct parsing. The parsing is a kind of consequence of choosing a certain investigative approach. And so it's not clear that, what would make one correct is if it could actually account for all of the variation or all of the expression of a trait one was interested in. That's the only test of the correctness of the parsing. And since none of them do, none of them can, because each of them has shown that there are dependencies in the explanandum on some part of that potential causal space.
Bill had a question.
I want to. I've also remembering your address. That, so, and I'm assuming it's appropriate to advertise for some of the features will come up in the talk tomorrow. But my real point, I mean, what surprised, what I, you have your colleague, Stanford, has always talking about the other alternatives.
Oh, Kyle Stanford. Yeah.
Yeah, and wanting to get, and it just occurred to me that these examples, especially the ones where you're beginning to get somewhere at trying to allow representations of more than one alternative, would be real examples of unpacking the other alternatives in an informative way. And so carrying off what he's saying we ought to be doing.
That's right, right.
And so I was really impressed with that. And now your answer to the last question, I want to, okay, violence and just focusing on internal, whether neurophysiological or this or that or traits, versus looking at the larger social context in which the person grows up. What would count? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the sorts of things that would count as saying you ought to be paying attention to this other thing, this social context thing. And I can't resist, I mean, think of all these kids from North America that are going to fight for ISIS. And maybe a big part of the causal factor is that because none of them have jobs. I mean, just put that up as a, but surely the, I think it's pretty clear that what would count as showing that we should have been putting this factor in, or we can make a big difference if we put it, if we look at these other things that are certain other things. And I also think it might turn out, I mean, it might be possible to have it, to even assess a little bit how much more informative it is to include this stuff than just look at that stuff. So I was surprised you didn't have a more positive answer to her question. Okay. I mean,
Well, I do have
possibilities. For
yeah. Well, I do have it. Okay, anticipating some of what I'm going to say tomorrow.
Everybody, it'll be great.
Well, I know you have to take his word for a lot of things. This particular parsing is intended to answer questions about differences or similarities within a population. Now, one of the things your question is pointing to is how do we pick the population? Your example, I think, points particularly to that question. You think about young people going off to fight, and not everyone who's had, grown up a Muslim in North America is going off, or grown up a Muslim in Europe is going off. Most are not. Most are not. So what's the difference in that population? But asking that question is a quite different question than trying to figure out in a general way what's the difference between or what accounts for the difference between the antisocial and the pro-social individual. And so one of the problems, of course, is that as humans we're divided into multiple subpopulations with kind of different, what we might call environments of rearing. which have a different effect on us. One of the assumptions of the, so maybe you're going to want me to give a different answer up there, but one of the assumptions of the behavior genetics work is that there is a kind of normal, or what's called the average expectable environment, and that's what's called the environment for purposes. But if we think that actually members of complex societies, you have to be thinking of environment in a very narrow way, like just did you have parents who fed you and so forth, in order to think that there's an average expectable environment that crosses all the different populations. Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, and that goes to kind of how we select our data. Yeah. Right. Does that do some of what you were asking? Okay.
I think we have time for one last very quick question.
Oh, okay. I'll make it as quick as I can. But I'm interested in realization over the past few weeks, and I'm particularly interested in the notion of realization of causal powers. So you talked a bit about causal powers, but your talk has me quite worried because if causes are incommensurate across disciplines, then talking about how it is that causal powers at one level of description are realized in a different level of description becomes nearly impossible for me to say if they're incommensurate out of here. So I have almost the opposite worry of the worry that was earlier expressed, that well, couldn't we just divide everything up very nicely, put everything into our different slots, and then when we've got all of our genetic causal stuff put over there, whatever's left over, then we move into our physiology slot and put everything that fits in there, and then we move over, and everything divides up nicely. My worry is that it is the opposite. It's not that we want to be able to try to do that, but it's that if things are as incommensurate as they might be on your story, it makes it very hard to talk about the relationship across sort of causal, the ways in which causes might relate to each other, not in additive ways, but just in terms of realization. So am I right to be worried, or is there something that I might take away as a positive part of the story for me?
Well, there are two levels at which you're talking here. You're talking both at the level of description and at the level of what actually happens in the world. So, and there, our levels of description, we might say, are, we think there's something real about them, but I also think that they're matters of convenience. So thinking about genes as opposed to neurophysiological processes, well, of course there's a difference between genes and neurophysiological processes. And we can, or it's possible to think about the roles that genetic configurations play in shaping certain kinds of neurophysiological. So if that's what you're thinking about in terms of causal powers, I don't see why not, because you're not trying to make the comparison. You're not trying to make the comparison between the neurophysiology and the genetic level. You're trying to talk about the causal relations between them, which is a very different kind of thing. So I wouldn't worry. It's if you find multiple kinds of factors at one level that you want to think of as being realized somehow at the other level, then you're going to have probably some problems. If they're measured in different ways, If I'm right about this, and that description carries over, but what you're describing is somewhat slightly different, I think.
Okay, well, let's thank Helen for a very stimulating